Welcome, everyone, to the Woodrow Wilson Center. We are congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. And we're also happy to welcome all of you here today, and C-SPAN, which is also filming this for their book talk. So thank you all. At Wilson, we are especially proud of our scholarship. We use it to power our discussions of the critical challenges facing us today. Rob Litwak's new book focuses on one of the most immediate challenges, tripolar instability and nuclear competition among the United States, Russia, and China. Best of all, for all of you and for people who are participating online, I want you to know this book is available as an ebook for free from the Wilson Center, and you can find it online on our website. So for this discussion, I am very proud to be sharing the stage with the best of the best. Rob Litwak is the Wilson Center's Senior Vice President and Director of International Security Studies. His strategic vision has really shaped the Wilson Center itself. In addition, his deep knowledge and critical thinking has shaped how many of us in this room understand nuclear issues and nonproliferation. His previous books on rogue states and U.S. foreign policy, on managing nuclear risks, and on nuclear crises with North Korea and Iran have defined debates in Washington and beyond. And that's no surprise, because Rob served on the National Security Council staff as Director for Nonproliferation and as a consultant to the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Now, his latest book goes straight to the core questions we are facing, and I really appreciate the opportunity to get your insight. Now, to help us ask the right questions, we've asked David Sanger to be part of this panel. He's been asking the right questions now throughout his career at the New York Times, and he has been its White House and national security correspondent. He's also a distinguished fellow here at Wilson. His most recent book was The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, which reads like a thriller for those of you who haven't read it yet. And you should get started because his next book will be coming out. He's working on it now. It is on the return of great power competition. So the synergy between these two is really clear. I'm going to start with a little bitty quote, and that is that in May of 2022, Henry Kissinger said that we were living in a totally new era. Cold War dynamics are being reshaped by emergent tripolarity. Can we draw from the lessons we've learned and apply them to risk management for the future? And with that question open and many others, I'm going to turn the floor over to David. Here's how to work. He's going to lead a discussion with Rob for a few minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions and also questions from our online participants. If you are participating with us online, please look for the submit a question box, and then it will pop up here, and I'll be able to see it and ask that question as part of the discussion. So, David, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Robin, and thank you, Rob, for giving us not only this book, Tripolar Instability, but your whole series of books on this topic. And it's just great to be here at the Wilson Center. I've done working on my third book at the Wilson Center, second one with Robin down the hall. To drop by every once in a while and make sure that I'm actually typing.
If it's late, it's not my fault.
Yeah, right. But big thanks as well to Rob, who makes sure that the Wilson Center not only is on the edge of scholarship, but is right on the news, that it's not simply going off in directions that are of great academic interest, but also of great practical purpose. And that is truly the case, maybe even more so than on your Iran and North Korea books, which were urgent at the time you wrote them and remain so today with tripolar instability. Because as Robin suggested, there is no bigger single problem, I think, facing national security officials in Washington than trying to figure out the changed relationship between Russia and China, the nature of cooperation between Russia and China, and what it means that we're seeing such an expansion of the Chinese arsenal. An expansion that the public estimates of the Pentagon suggest will bring them from their minimum deterrent of 300 weapons currently, 200 to 300, to about 1,000 by the end of this decade, and to 1,500 by 2035, which would be coincidentally exactly around the limits that the US and the Russians are facing now with New START. And New START expires in under 1,000 days, with no real prospect, it looks like, of something being negotiated to replace it. Rob is so on the news that my wonderful colleague, Bill Broad, published today in the Science Times section of the Times, a great article called The Terror of Threes. And in fact, it's the three-body problem that Rob is trying to address here today. So Rob, as we think about this, and we think about the fact that it was only 10 years ago, less really, that Barack Obama talked about redesigning US strategy to diminish the role of nuclear weapons in American foreign policy, that we find ourselves in this situation where we have a very real risk of heading the other way. So talk us a little bit through the central thesis of tripolar instability, which is to say, why is it that introducing a third major strategic adversary, since China's had nuclear weapons now since 1964, is so complicated? It's not immediately obvious to everyone why it undoes so much that we know about deterrence, or that we think we know.
Well, good day to all of you. Thank you, Robin, for that kind introduction, and David for your participation today and your presence at the Wilson Center, as a fellow. Let me address your question by, I think, the obvious starting point. Let me unpack the title of my publication, Tripolar Instability. China became a nuclear weapon state in 1964, but long had an arsenal that was small relative to that of the United States and the then Soviet Union. As you mentioned, David, China is now under Xi Jinping's modernization program, which is comprehensive, economic, military, new assertive political role, encompasses a drive toward numerical parity with the United States and Russia, probably in the 2030s, as you indicated. That system level change, a shift from bipolarity to tripolarity, is compounded by three destabilizing developments. First, competition is extending into new domains of cyberspace and outer space. You've written extensively about that, David. Second, there are no guardrails. The arms control architecture of the Cold War era has been dismantled to the point of near collapse, so that the competition among the major powers is essentially unconstrained now. And third, as we know from the headlines, there are ongoing crises. There's a war in Ukraine and a potential crisis in Taiwan. These developments, the system level change and these drivers of potential escalation in a crisis, are eroding the foundations of strategic stability. During the Cold War, the foundation of strategic stability was a stable balance of terror between the United States and the Soviet Union. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union each deployed secure, invulnerable systems that created mutual vulnerability. And a assured retaliatory capability on both sides, which was the hallmark of mutual vulnerability, created an uneasy but stable peace. The United States never adjusted to the vulnerability of that era, but it was the foundation. What the balance of terror did was to deflect competition to peripheral areas, the so-called third world, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the other crisis points during the Cold War. And my central argument is that the developments I mentioned, the system level change, plus the new developments, cyber and outer space, the lack of constraints as arms control collapses, and ongoing crises are recasting the dangers of the Cold War period. That the balance of terror is less stable as the incentives for preemptive action in a crisis are being recreated, and the stakes are no longer peripheral. It's not about Afghanistan or parts of the periphery of the Soviet Union or parts of what we then call the Third World. These are vital interests. Ukraine is the key to the future of Europe. Taiwan is central in Northeast Asia and is of declared vital interest to both sides. So the balance of terror is less stable, and the stakes are now vital. That's the elements of tripolar instability in the title of my work.
That's great, and that takes us, right to sort of the central question. So the argument of the book is that you can't simply extend that understanding of mutual vulnerability and mutual assured destruction, which was the key to the two-way contest with the Soviet Union, and then, of course, with its successor state. Because once you add in China and this uneasy relationship that they have with Russia, you get what Ernie Moniz said to Bill Broad was a conceptual problem. And I'll just read you the rest of his quote here, because I wanted you to sort of correlate this with your argument. We've got to change the traditional approach of equalizing weapons or strategic delivery systems, but how to do that is still unclear. Now, since this problem has emerged, I've talked about it with a handful of members of the Senate and a few members of the House who deal in strategic issues, who deal in national security issues. And I think it's fair to say, it's one of the reasons I was so glad that you wrote this book, that the understanding of the instability that's being inserted is pretty weak right now. So give us a fairly concrete sense of why this is such a different deterrence problem, and how it is, for example, that we might think of some frameworks to address it.
Let me parse it this way, that there's a numeric dimension to this which you focus on, like numbers of strategic warheads. But as I laid out in my initial comment, there are drivers of escalation. And it's in a context where there's no ongoing dialogue with either of these parties. With Russia, we're in the middle of a war. It's not the time to have that kind of conversation. With China, and hat tip to my colleague Robert Daly, who heads our Kissinger Institute, we don't have common terms of reference even with the Chinese. We don't have the shared history with them. Our key dates, 1914, 1962, don't have the same meaning to them. Their concept of deterrence, Robert was telling me, if you deconstruct the characters that go into their word for deterrence, includes not only what we think of as deterrence, like a threat to prevent an action, but also has a compellent aspect to it, which could open the door to coercive diplomacy. So the framework, we're not operating from a common conceptual framework. And then once if that is not enough of a hurdle, you have to look at the dynamic, which is much more complicated than the Cold War era. You're dealing with kind of the numeric dimension of it. What does it mean if China builds up to numeric parity with the United States and Russia? But it's in a context where there are these drivers of escalation that I mentioned at the outset. And this creates openings for three types of escalation. Inadvertent, accidental escalation, and we had a number of false alerts during the Cold War that almost led to nuclear use. You could have inadvertent escalation, where one side takes an action that the other side doesn't view as escalatory, but the other side does. For example, China, in an opening of a conflict, David, they might go after U.S. satellites in space or introduce malware, and they may not think that it's escalatory because no one's being killed, bluntly, but it would be significantly escalatory. So there's that risk of inadvertent escalation. And then the third category of escalation is deliberate or instrumental escalation. And I think this is really, where the debate is most central in terms of the current constellation of factors. The Nobel Prize winner, Thomas Schelling, talked about a competition in risk-taking. And if you look at how the nuclear balance is shifting in tandem with conventional military balances, most acutely in Northeast Asia, it could leave China to shift its calculus of risk-taking and think it could do certain things in the Taiwan context that it had not hitherto done. And Russia, and I'm sure we'll turn to it, is facing, a simultaneous crisis, a domestic crisis that played out over the weekend, but also the military front in the Donbass, which is undergoing a Ukrainian counteroffensive, which creates a decision point for Putin on kind of escalation or not.
Well, that's what I wanted to turn to next, although I have to say that your mention of Schelling, who was the original sort of theorist in the Cold War for this, brought back memories to me of really difficult final exams that I did not really want to go revisit. So let's dig in a little deeper on Russia. As you noted before, note in the book, we've had a lot of things that have been unraveling the nuclear balance just with Russia alone. Separate out the China problem here. So we've had the demise of a series of treaties that was already happening before President Trump took office, but it accelerated during that time. I mentioned that New START, which was extended for 5 years at the very beginning of the Biden administration, has no provision in it for another renewal. So you'd have to start negotiating from the ground up. They started those very preliminary discussions before the war broke out. They haven't had any in 16 months. The threat to use tactical weapons by Putin at various points led President Biden to say at a fundraiser in New York last October that we were the closest we had been to an Armageddon moment at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think kind of shocked the people standing around James Murdoch's living room with a nice glass of white wine in their hands, who hadn't really thought that they were coming for an Armageddon speech. So even if China was not revising its strategy, would you argue that what held the balance of terror together during the Cold War, as you referred to it, would be falling apart anyway?
That's a great question. We're in a situation where we're in the midst of essentially two Cold Wars, one with Russia and one with China. And these new Cold Wars are playing out at a time when the foundations of strategic stability that emerged from the old Cold War are being eroded and are with nothing to supplant it because there's no dialogue. And I think one of the questions, implicit in your question is this truly a triangular relationship? And in the study, I talk about I don't go for astrophysics like in the William Broad piece. I go for just plane geometry, and I say that it's more of an isosceles triangle than an equilateral triangle. That it was never truly equal. That you just think of it. China economically has a $20 trillion economy. The United States has a $26 trillion economy. Russia's economy is $2 trillion, the size of Italy. No denigration of Italy, but it's sort of in this millennium not a major world power in terms of arsenals. Russia and the United States have had large arsenals during the Cold War to the point beyond kind of rational relation to any strategy. And China has moved from the minimum deterrent that you mentioned to approaching parity. I think that in terms of framing right now, the question is this truly tripolar, or is it really, does the United States really face twin bipolar programs, a Russia problem and a China problem? And I think that the door to that latter optic is I've just mixed a metaphor of optics and doors there, but anyway, did you get my point? That Russia and China, are not adversarial states at this time. In 1969, when they almost went to war, they were. So that part of the asymmetry and why it's why it's not an equilateral triangle is because Russia and China combine both capabilities and hostile adversarial intent toward the United States, and the United States has to deal with them in those terms. But there's no one in Moscow or Beijing presumably thinking of like, gee, what does the three-peer problem mean for us? Because the prospect of conflict between Russia and China, is remote at this point.
What I find fascinating about this argument, Rob, is that there isn't really agreement yet that I hear in the strategic community about the fundamental question that you raised, which is, do we have a tripolar problem or do we have two bipolars? I noticed that Zig Hecker, who of course ran Los Alamos National Lab and then was at Stanford for many years, said in this same piece this morning, I don't see Russia and China getting together on nuclear strategies. I see this as two bipolars, okay? On the other hand, we've got a China and Russia who have talked about a relationship with no limits. They've done military exercises together, not nuclear exercises, but military exercises. They both clearly see an advantage in being our antagonist. Could you imagine a situation in which they put together a common nuclear strategy, even if they both reserved all their launch authorities and so forth to themselves?
Well, as de Gaulle put it, states don't have friends; they have interests. And we've seen in the China-Russia and previously the Soviet relationship, it's waxed and waned. Currently, their interests align. I think that Putin and Xi pulled a reverse Kissinger of sorts. In 1969, Kissinger-Nixon, initiated an opening to China to outflank the then rising Soviet Union. Putin and Xi have come together to address for them, the issue of American hyperpower. But the no limits sounds like hyperbole that defies kind of historical experience. They have a long, at times contested border. There's this asymmetry of in their economies where China's 20 trillion, Russia's 2 trillion. I guess Russia's pivoted from selling oil and natural gas to Europe to sort of trying to shift to China as a potential market. So there's a convergence of interest there. But could this extend into the nuclear era? Russia transferred early warning systems to China in 2018. This was in the press. China has a launch on warning doctrine, and we have had a history that I alluded to of false alerts. So that's a real concern, and that would be a topic on any strategic stability dialogue with China. And this is where the numbers come in. What if you took the Chinese arsenal and added it to the emerging Chinese arsenal and you added it to the existing Russian arsenal? Does that mean that the United States should have a force equal to kind of 2x, so to speak, that it would have to be equal to Russia and China? And there you get into the numbers, the perennial issue that goes back to the Cold War era, which the Rand Corporation, Alan Enthoven and others asked in a different historical context, how much is enough? And I think while the United States has 2/3 of its nuclear deterrent essentially at sea in existing technologies, in vulnerable submarines that could more than mount a devastating blow on Russia and China, putting basically both of them out of existence as functioning societies, and we are under a threat, a commensurate threat from them. And that has been this infelicitous, mutual assured destruction and the balance of terror as a foundation of stability, which is hard to adjust to psychologically. I don't think the numbers per se make the huge difference. I mean, Stalin said quantity becomes quality. At times, yes, the numbers going up is a factor, affecting strategic stability. But I think in the publication, I look at these drivers of escalation that I started out with: cyber and outer space, no constraints, no common dialogue, and with China, no common conceptual framework that we're operating from. And third, an ongoing war and I'd like to come back to the Putin-Ukraine escalatory issue that you alluded to, and a potential crisis in China, with China over Taiwan. And there, the conventional balance in Northeast Asia is shifting. At the same time, the nuclear balance is shifting towards China. And the question there, in terms of managing relations, is could this lead to increased Chinese risk-taking? Robert Daly has a nice formulation where if the United States does the necessary, prevent an erosion of the conventional balance in Northeast Asia, and that's a heavy lift, and maintain the nuclear balance, the balance of terror, that we're not going to change China's long-term objectives. You know, they're all in on Taiwan as part of China and are kind of anxious to move forward on it. But we can change their calculus of decision so that we'll say, not this year, you know, and we push it off. And buying time is important in diplomacy. That's the Taiwan piece, but I'm happy to kind of say more on Ukraine.
Well, let's do that. You know, when you read into your essay, you have this really fascinating section that discusses the basic principles document that came out in 2020, under which Russia would employ nuclear weapons. A lot of this, I believe, was done by General Gerasimov, who's been in the news just a little bit this weekend. And you say in here, Putin's nuclear threats during the war should be viewed in the context of these principles. And one of them is an existential threat to the state. And we haven't seen that in Russia in some time until Saturday. Mm-hmm. But you make out the point that is, in his mind, synonymous with the survival of his regime. And that Russian nuclear saber rattling is provoking Western fears. Is it your guesswork now that we see a paranoid Vladimir Putin who now has discovered he's got more to be paranoid about, with some good reason, likely to turn back to his nuclear arsenal the way he has when things were going badly in Ukraine?
One of the conditions you've alluded to under Russian doctrine, the country would consider nuclear use as an existential threat to the state, which he holds as synonymous with the Putin regime. And this is where the Ukraine war and the future of the Putin regime become connected vessels. And we've tried to parse it and say that the United States has said regime change is not an objective in Russia, with the addendum, but normal relations with Russia are not possible as long as Putin is in power. That's a real contradiction, to use a word from the Soviet lexicon. The director of Central Intelligence, William Burns, has said that his word desperate Putin might consider nuclear use, and one of the conditions has been a collapse of the military front in Ukraine, or it's really an and/or some threat to the regime back in the Kremlin.
Or Crimea. He's added in Crimea.
He added in Crimea, and I think this brings us to what happened over the weekend. As they say in Law and Order TV show, ripped from today's headlines. And I don't have an answer to your question, but let me just kind of analytically lay out where the debate is and where the fissure is. Okay. Prior to this weekend, I think there was one view was, sort of driven by this view of a desperate Putin might act, is that if Zelensky went, and the Zelensky government really went for it, tried to reestablish the pre-2014 boundaries of Ukraine, that could be a condition under which Putin would consider the use of a tactical nuclear weapon as a shock to the system, to say, Western governments, you need to get control over Zelensky and rein him in and bring this conflict to an end. The Biden administration, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, using the metaphor, he said, we're not going to slice the salami. Nuclear use is nuclear use, and even a low-yield weapon would be considered a nuclear weapon, laid down a deterrent marker. But that view of Putin, Russia, and escalation was there needed to be care with Ukrainian war objectives, because if they went for a return to status quo, antebellum back to 2014, that could trigger Russian Putin's nuclear use. Since the weekend, when Putin, facing an existential threat, apparently, and it's opaque and it's playing out in real time, backed down, there's been a view that, look, what happened when he faced an existential threat? He probably kind of got outside Moscow. He made some type of a compromise to ameliorate the situation. He didn't immediately escalate. That assessment then has led to those to calls for the West to be all in on Ukraine's kind of maximalist geographic aspirations. That's the pole of the debate right now, and I don't have an answer to it. One version is that if Ukraine goes for it, it could trigger escalation. The other is that Putin has shown that he will accommodate even to an existential threat, and that the United States should not and NATO should not self-deter themselves by trying to rein in Zelensky in this counteroffensive. But I don't have an answer to that question.
We're getting near the moment for people to come in with questions of their own, so let me just ask you one or two more, Rob, because this is so fascinating. Okay, so imagine you're Xi Jinping right now. I realize most mornings you get up and say, what if I was running China? And you've got the Americans on your case to start up some kind of discussion. Okay? The first thing you think is, they've got 1,550 deployed and several thousand stored. We've got 200 to 300 deployed, building silos. It's going to be a decade before, maybe more, before we're even up to their levels. What possible incentive does he have to enter that discussion until his arsenal is roughly the size of the U.S. arsenal or the Russian arsenal, or until it's as invulnerable because of submarines and other capabilities as those are?
He had minimal incentive to maintain a minimum deterrent under conditions. Chinese decision-making is opaque. We don't know why China decided to build up to parity. It might be one version of what's going on is it's a natural extension of Xi Jinping's comprehensive modernization program. This is the accoutrement of being a great power or superpower in the world. But I think we also have to be take into account what we do and how it's perceived in Beijing. That there were one line of strategic analysis in our debate when China had a small nuclear arsenal was, great, let's take it out in a first strike during a crisis, and we'd be able to dictate, we the United States could dictate a pattern of stability on China. They read these journals in Beijing, and presumably, and they have the capabilities to build up. An irony is that after the space shuttle exploded, the United States was reliant on Chinese space launch vehicles to put our satellites into orbit. So they have a very robust program to build long-range, missiles, and it's not a heavy lift for them to ramp up. What can we talk to them about? I think that we have to be modest in our expectations. It would be useful if we had strategic stability talks, which the Chinese have eschewed. Their Minister of Defense, I believe, is under U.S. sanction, and that's a bit of a problem in terms of a dialogue from the Chinese perspective.
And they view the guardrails we're talking about as pure containment.
Pure containment and American rationale to lock in superiority. And, it's their narrative, and they can certainly put together a history and empirical data points to support their view of history. I think, what can we do from where we're at now? I think a strategic stability talks with Russia, with China, should be on issues of concepts of deterrence and drivers of escalation, so there's a clarity of understanding. And we're not entering an era where there will be new arms control agreements, per se, but we may be able to develop tacit understandings about norms. China did an anti-satellite test that generated thousands of pieces of space debris in low Earth orbit, and our own International Space Station has to dodge around some of these pieces. It generated some good science fiction movies as well. The space debris thing, it's in no one's interest to pollute space, low Earth orbit with anti-satellite tests. That would be a constraint and would assist in kind of moderating any temptation in a crisis to start launching attacks on satellites, because you wouldn't have tested systems that would allow you to do that. Artificial intelligence, which is a topic that I know you're addressing, David, you've done your reporting and it's in your new book, that's out there on the horizon. And under accidental escalation, we had episodes during the Cold War where there were false alerts, like flocks of geese that were mistakenly viewed as incoming American missiles in 1983 and in the then Soviet Union. If you combine launch on warning doctrines with early warning systems that are known to have had problems, and as the line from Dr. Strangelove went after there was the attack on the then Soviet Union, General Turgis said, "I wouldn't knock the whole program because of one failure." Well, if we have one failure, it would be catastrophic. If you add to that, and this is for a chapter you probably haven't even written yet, AI, artificial intelligence, to automatic launch, systems. I say no more in terms of the potential, threat for escalation. That's why the Biden administration, in a smart move, has laid out norms of conduct to manage artificial intelligence in the military sphere. And one of the norms was, that I don't think anyone would take issue with, is that a human being should be in the chain of decision-making on any nuclear use. So let's go for tacit norms as a vehicle. And the United States has to do its part. We have to play out our hand and to reinforce deterrence and extended deterrence, which I know is of interest to Robin. One variant of deterrence, most of us recognize deterrence by punishment, the threat of punishment. If you do this, then that. But the other variant of deterrence is deterrence by denial, which is actions that are taken to confound and to block the efforts of the adversary, so that if we harden our infrastructure to protect against malware attacks, if we harden our satellites to make them less vulnerable to probing by an adversary, toughen our targets, that could be a deterrent for an adversary taking action.
Saying an attack wouldn't work.
Exactly. They couldn't be sure that it would work, and launching it would start a process where they might lose control.
Well, Rob, a last point here. You raised AI. There is a lot of discussion about making that the first area that you wall off for this. Mm-hmm. But the last thing I wanted to ask you about is the use by China and Russia now of hypersonic delivery vehicles, mm-hmm. which is a way basically to evade our protections. Add to the instability?
Absolutely. I mean, emerging technologies and this is where this picks up the comment, I think, of former Secretary Moniz about, numbers and concepts and categories. Hypersonics are a new category. It can be used, suborbital and deliver, an ordnance at distance, in tens of minutes, which decreases the time for decision makers to make decisions. And it's being tested in both conventional and potentially nuclear mode by China and Russia.
Yeah.
The United States has said ours are only for conventional ordnance. It's unclear with China and Russia. So if they see a hypersonic system coming in, which can evade, defenses, and strategic defense has been kind of the black hole of defense spending in terms of money spent to try to get the desired outcome. Is it a nuclear system coming in, or is it a conventional one? And that blurring of conventional and nuclear, which arises in a number of contexts, like the co-location of conventional and nuclear systems, so that if you're attacking a conventional system but that's co-located with nuclear, you may be escalating it without, and Barry Posen from MIT wrote a book, and has really done the lead thinking on this, inadvertent escalation from the commingling of conventional and nuclear systems. So the motto of the Wilson Center is to peace. My unofficial motto is to peace. Long may it require study. There are a lot of challenges out there, analytical and otherwise, and the Wilson Center's role is to promote policy-relevant scholarship, which is what I've tried to do in this publication.
And done it very successfully. So Robin, let me turn this back to you for your own questions and those of our audience.
Thank you. So for the audience in the room, your moment is coming, right? So think about this. Get your questions together. I got a bunch of them online so that you've got competition. Meanwhile, while you're thinking, I'm going to just ask one of my own questions to Rob. Drawing on my time, some of you know I was our acting ambassador in Berlin, and I am especially attuned, therefore, to how our allies rely on the extended deterrence that couples our security and the ability to resist coercion. And you talk about this a bit in your book. Can you tell us more about the hardware and software needed to keep that extended deterrence going? And my question is, are we doing enough?
Great question, and let me preface it with a historical point of reference. Right now, there are 9 nuclear weapon states, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council that were brought into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as nuclear weapon states. There are 3 states, India, Pakistan, Israel, which exercised their sovereign right and never joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You had North Korea, became a nuclear weapon state in 2006. It's treated differently because it was in the NPT and cheated within it. And then you have Iran, which is a nuclear threshold state. We don't live in a world where there are 30 or 40 nuclear weapon states. And that assumption wasn't always the case. In the 1950s, there were studies by the RAND Corporation. In 1962, President Kennedy gave a speech at the UN General Assembly where he talked about a world of 30 or 40 nuclear weapon states. That led to the negotiations that culminated in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We don't live in that world, and one of the major reasons why we don't, and there's an established literature on this, is the U.S. extended deterrent commitment. Why Germany doesn't think it needs its own nuclear weapon, Japan doesn't, South Korea doesn't, the nuclear umbrella. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, talked about the hardware and the software of extended deterrence. So that during the Ukraine war, the United States, NATO augmented its dual-use nuclear-capable aircraft in Europe. There are questions about Northeast Asia, where the United States and Russia and the then Soviet Union withdrew tactical nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula. And there's a question now about how the United States should address the nuclear balance in Northeast Asia to address this competition and risk-taking that I alluded to vis-a-vis China and Taiwan, the nuclear piece of it, what is necessary there to bolster Japan and South Korea. What can we do? We can do more. That's the hardware side of it, so to speak. The software side are the consultations, which are institutionalized through the nuclear planning group within NATO, which you worked in Brussels as well and are conversant, know all about that. David's about to go to the NATO summit meeting covering that, where I'm sure nuclear planning discussions are going to be a point on, important point on the agenda. We don't have that type of institutionalized framework with Japan, and South Korea, but there are discussions with them to talk about, nuclear contingencies and what can be done to bolster deterrence, taking into account Japan's constitution, which places limitations on their ability to develop offensive systems, and South Korea, where there is a debate and a certain disjunction actually now between popular opinion on developing an independent nuclear capability and the South Korean government's commitment to kind of its allied relationship with the United States and the extended deterrent, commitment. So that's are we doing enough? It just requires constant tending and adjustments as circumstances change, and I think those circumstances have emphatically changed in the last year.
Yeah. Okay. All right. For those in the room, this is your moment, right? We have a microphone, so this will eventually be coming your way, and I'll take the question here.
Dave Ottaway here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Rob, what is your assessment of why Putin moved tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus And is this something you think the NATO or the U.S. should be responding to?
Well, Putin, who operates from his own, historical narrative of grievance and the place of Russia in the world, he's made a number of assertions, including that Russia has a special commitment to Russians outside of the Russian Federation. Russia does not have natural boundaries. There are 25 million or so Russians in other parts, in adjacent countries, and he's declared kind of an extraterritorial commitment to defend those individuals. I remember from the Cold War period when the then Soviets would say, we feel surrounded by NATO and China. The quip back was, if I had 11 time zones, I'd feel surrounded too. Why Belarus? I mean, Belarus is let's call it as it is. It's a vassal state of Russia. Lukashenko has kind of a limited scope for autonomous action. It's sort of in, if you want to go there in kind of mafia kind of analogies, it's one of the five families. He's out there managing the Belarus, portfolio. The notion that Belarus would have autonomous control over Russian deployed nuclear systems really kind of beggars kind of belief. They would remain under control of Russians if they've been deployed. Putin, of course, in his own kind of, his own framework of grievance and Russia's role in the world, basically said, we're doing nothing different than what the United States has done by deploying tactical nuclear weapons in Europe with dual use system. So,
Not a bad point, because
No.
that is in fact what we have done.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before I take another audience question, don't worry, I'm coming back to y'all. I'm going to give you an online question because it comes from a colleague at King's College, and also because it is very specific in what it is proposing. So I thought I would give this to you from Claire Whalen. With China operating under an arms-chasing mentality, do you believe that they could be persuaded to participate in arms control discussions if the U.S. and Russia were to agree on a middling number that the three poles could settle on, and said, let's say hard cap at 750? You talked a little bit about the disparities in forces. I'm going to give you her proposal to respond.
Well, that's a great question, and David kind of alluded to it. That right now there's the New START Treaty, which had its lineage going back to the Cold War era through different iterations, which limit the United States and Russia to 1,550 deployable systems. Russia has, under Putin, has suspended aspects of compliance with that in terms of consultations and inspections, but Russia significantly has not abrogated the treaty, as in signaling a step of building up beyond 1,550. The question that's been posed online, I think, is really a central one as we move forward and look to 2026 and what will happen then. I heard one analyst say that arms control is dead, dead, dead. One dead would have been enough. The others are redundant. But to make the emphatic point, I think that back to countries have interests. And even with the tortured history, and China's not been party to it, and that they have been numerically inferior, so asking them to join and lock in American superiority is a real concern for them. But I could just analytically, and I would defer to the China watchers like Robert Daly, on whether this is realistic or not. I could see a Chinese interest in wanting to lock the United States and Russia into a lower number, rather than having just unconstrained, buildups, so that it's analytically possible to see how we could get there. Politically, I don't know. And I end the study with a nice quote from Einstein, who was challenged, like, you crack the atom and you unravel the mysteries of the atom, but yet you can't come up with a system to manage the control of the atom so that we don't destroy ourselves, don't destroy humanity. And Einstein, quipped back, that's because physics is easier than politics. And we're now in the realm of like what you can analytically lay out. And I really, that was, I think, the approach in the book here. It's not a hard advocacy book. It's trying to lay out the analytical, landscape and where the fissures and the debates are, and what would be the prerequisites for policymakers to make decisions such as the one reflected in the question, which is a great one. I'm not sure the 750 number would be the one that lock into it. It might be a higher number, but I think the concept is analytically valid. Whether politically we can get there or not, I think is the open question.
Okay. All right. So we are in the room, and I'm going to take the right down here. Yep, that's you.
Hi, Robert. My name is Igor. Until last month, I was a fellow here at the Wilson Center at the Kissinger Institute. Now, U.S. correspondent for the South China Morning Post. My question is regarding like the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine by Russia. Many China experts and analysts, they say that if Putin decides to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, that would be the red line for Beijing. Because according to the core principles, like foreign policy core principles, nuclear weapons should be used for deterrence, not to attack another country. But also like territorial integrity was supposed to be one of the core principles for the Chinese as well. And we've seen that it's not the case since they've been aligning with Russia since the invasion of Ukraine. And I was wondering, first, if you think that China would indeed side with the West if Russia deploys nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and second, if that would give NATO a reason to get directly involved in the conflict, arguing that nuclear contamination would be sort of like a direct attack to like NATO allies. Thank you.
Well, that contingency would really put the no limits formulation to the test. I think that there would be a limit, and the Chinese have already alluded to it. There have been meetings where with the Chinese and Indian leaders where they had contact with Putin, where, I mean, they don't use our terminology of red line, but where they made it clear that nuclear use would be a threshold that would be create a whole new international reality. So I think that's something that the Russians have to take into account. But your point about territorial integrity. Russia has now annexed the provinces and the oblasts in the Ukraine and have claimed that they are part of the Russian Federation. So and this is the nub, where Russia says we'll use nuclear weapons if there's a threat to the state, which they hold as synonymous with Putin regime, and that state also now encompasses these irredentist claims that Russia had against Ukraine, and that creates this zone of uncertainty on escalation. I tried to, I characterized where the debate is now of whether, of how the situation on the battlefield could affect, Putin's calculus of deterrence, having just been through, a weekend where there was a surprise existential threat to the survival of his regime.
Now, for those of you in the room, you're going to have a chance to talk to Rob after this. So I'm going to take one last question from our online contributors, and that is from former Ambassador Laura Kennedy, who asks, do you see the ability of the P5 process to tackle some of these issues that you have so elegantly laid out? After all, experts have now spent years developing a common nuclear glossary, discussing doctrine, maybe baby steps, but at this difficult time, it's the only game in town.
That's a great question. The P5+1 mechanism was championed by the Wilson Center's own Baroness Catherine Ashton to bring about the Iran nuclear deal. And the prior administration, U.S. administration, withdrew from that deal. There had been hopes that that model could be built upon to address other issues. Mm-hmm. And even when Ukraine, after 2014, and David spent a lot of time in hotels eating chocolate covering these meetings, as I recall, pulling late nights. Even during that period, Russia and China cooperated with the United States in bringing about the Iran nuclear deal because they had a shared interest in constraining Iran's nuclear ambitions. I think we're in the middle of a war in Ukraine, and we're at a nadir point with China. So I don't know what the immediate practical possibilities are of a P5+1. Right now, Russia is a pariah state, so would not be included. But I think that on a pragmatic basis, and as to put my cards on the table, people talk about what's your theory of international relations, which is really kind of a disguised question about ideology. I'm a card-carrying utilitarian, kind of what works and what's in our interest, and we should try it. And that's what's kind of motivated the analysis here. We should look for opportunities to explore and how this mechanism could be used, but we're not there. We're at a nadir point with China. We need to do some rehabilitative work to get to that point where we could even resume a conversation with China about other issues. Just a footnote on China. Back in the Cold War, China was in terms of proliferation, was the more the better, or more the hard. They sort of shrugged at increased numbers of nuclear weapon states, and China transferred know-how to Pakistan, which found its way to Libya. The Chinese have really gotten religion, so to speak, on nuclear issues, and recognized, they've taken non-proliferation on board as an interest. They've not always been as helpful as they could be on North Korea, but I think that there is some predicate there for engaging them, certainly on these issues, but it's going to be a steep climb.
Thank you. So I want to thank both of our panelists, Rob for writing this book and making the geometry fascinating for us, David for asking all the right questions and guiding us through the book and posing some questions from your own experience as well. So for those of you who are here in person, the book is available outside in hard copy. Again, it is also available online as an ebook on the Wilson Center website. So do please go there. No excuses for not reading it, right? And thanks again to C-SPAN for also featuring us.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin.